So, welcome to another discussion following on our discussions about battles of the Great War. We started with the Somme, looking at those through the lens, quite literally, of official photographs taken by official photographers during the Great War. So, we started with the 1st of July, then we moved on to the end of the Battle of the Somme, and then last time we looked at the Battle of Arras, the last time we did this. Now, this time we're kind of following that chronology on and we've moved on to June of 1917 and the Battle of Messines, one of the most important battles in those 4 years of fighting at Ypres for all kinds of reasons, many of which I'm sure we will discuss during the course of this talk. If I can get the buttons to work. So, in terms of the Western Front in 1917, previously we looked at Arras, the kind of southern part of the British line in France, where following the Battle of the Somme, the attacks on the Hindenburg line took place, the capture of Messines Ridge to the north, the fighting on the main Hindenburg line to the east and the southeast of the city of Arras, resulting in ground gain, but at great cost, and the continuation of trench warfare on the Western Front, because although the battle in its early stages was often quite successful, it didn't achieve the great breakthrough, and the French offensive to the south in the Champagne had not achieved what it intended to, with heavy losses. It had led to mutinies in the French army, the first use of tanks by the French, which had not gone particularly well either. So this was a battle that had great hopes, another one of these joint offensives on the Western Front, but it had not quite delivered what it had hoped to do. But what it showed is that the British Army, and by that the British Expeditionary Force and all of the Empire Commonwealth nations within it, were learning the art of trench warfare on the Western Front, but more importantly, learning the art of the offensive on the Western Front to try and break through. That time when it would be truly achieved and understood, and a modern battle fought with a modern army wouldn't come until 1918, but this was all part of the pathway to that. Now, from the British point of view, for most of the war, their focus was on Ypres, the fighting at Ypres in the northern part of this map, where the British had fought in defence of Ypres in 1914, and then again with the German gas attack the following year in April and May, when using poison gas for the first time, the Germans had tried to break through. It had become sacrificial ground, and the city of Ypres and its ruins in that city were very much symbols already of the Great War. They were all over the popular magazines of the day. They appeared in the newsreels that were shown, the silent newsreels that were shown in cinemas, and they were in just about every newspaper. It was a household name, and the cost of defending Ypres was brought home to so many families across that vast empire and right across Great Britain too. But it'd been a quiet sector of the Western Front for quite some time by 1917, because the war had shifted to France. France, the major partner on the Western Front, wasn't really that interested in Belgium because it wasn't France. And it was looking to expel the enemy, Germany, from mainland France. And in 1916 and early 1917, British and Commonwealth forces had found themselves fighting on the Somme and at Arras, as we've said, in these offensives to try and push the Germans out. Now, from the Commander-in-Chief's point of view, Douglas Haig, who had taken over after the Battle of Loos in 1915, the British sector, his focus had always been Flanders. And even in 1916, there had been a plan to launch an offensive along the Messines Ridge, because following that use of poison gas by the Germans in 1915, although they hadn't achieved a breakthrough using that gas, what they had captured was pretty much all of the high ground around Ypres. The line had closed even more around the city of Ypres than on this map, which is one of those that's in the Michelin Guide to the Battles of Ypres that was published in 1919. But the creation of that bulge, that salient around Ypres, had seen 2 years of static trench warfare, no major battles, minor operations, day-to-day activities of trench warfare, men being killed often without ever firing a shot, just holding the line. And when we go there today, we see that in the cemeteries around Ypres. There are many, many cemeteries close to these forward positions that were held during that 2 year period, in which none of those men died in the great battles. They died just holding the line. That was far more common than is realised. And if any of you, and I know some of you have researched a war memorial in Britain, you will find that most of the men didn't die in those big battles. They died in places like Ypres, just holding that line in a so-called quiet period. But following the fighting on the Somme and the outcome of Arras, attention turned to Flanders once more for a number of different reasons, but mainly to do with the German occupation of the high ground, because this was a landscape that was relatively flat. Most of the so-called hills here were tens of meters, not hundreds of meters above sea level, but on a flat landscape, that didn't matter. If you were Hill 60 or Hill 80, we discussed this in a recent podcast Q&A, you were high enough to afford whoever defended that ground some kind of advantage on the battlefields. And the Germans have that advantage, holding the high ground to the east and northeast of Ypres, and that big swathe of the Messines Ridge, which they captured even earlier in the fighting there in 1914. And the Germans had dug deep onto that ridge during that time, that Messines Ridge. And this is a photograph that I acquired some years ago when we were making a program about some archaeology at Messines, which we're going to come on to in this talk. And it shows a trench occupied by Bavarian soldiers just east of Messines sometime in 1916, showing the typical German trench of that period. Trenches that you'll see replicated in Bayernwald or Krunart Wood if you go there today, and we've had a podcast live event from there in the past. And we can see that kind of wattle and daub supports on the side of the trench and the typical duck boards, all of which you see replicated in Bayernwald. And you can see that big steel door on this photograph as well, which the Germans are using as some kind of steel plating to protect them, possibly in a forward sap. When I got this and when we looked into it, I think we came to the conclusion that it come from a brick factory just on the western side of Messines, and the Germans had had all the doors off because they were thick steel doors, and they'd used them in forward positions like this. I was rather hoping the archaeologists might have found one of these, but they didn't. But this gives us a bit of a peek into an insight into the German positions that had been constructed on this ridge. And it wasn't just the high ground that gave them the advantage. It was the fact that they could pretty much unhindered prepare positions like this in depth. So with a front line trench, often on the very crest or just over the crest, looking down onto the British positions, a second line, normally on the reverse slope of the ridge, and a third line, a fallback position to that as well. So it was very much defence in depth, and most of it built without much interruption from the enemy, from the British, because of this long period of quiet trench warfare. I mean, there was shelling, of course, but I've got images of Messines in 1917 where most of the buildings are still standing prior to the final bombardment. So it's clear that these places weren't quite wiped off the map, which we always kind of think when we think of First World War landscapes. And then on the British side, similar kind of network of trenches built during that long period of static trench warfare. This is a private photograph taken in the early summer of 1917 at Ypres, showing a British Tommy sitting on a fire step, pretending or either actually eating some grub out of that Dixie that's sitting on there. And it gives us a bit of an insight into the British trenches. The German ones always look far more permanent because they were built with a defensive mentality, an idea that they were going to be there for as long as possible to let the Allies, the British, attack them, suffer heavy losses, and perhaps sue for peace, whereas the British policy was always an offensive one. And so don't make your trenches too nice, too comfortable, because we want those guys to at some point leave them, go over the top and make their attack. And this is the kind of thing you see very clearly in the difference between those trench systems, even in photographs like this. But the landscape of the Messines Ridge, those are a couple of private photographs from the old frontline archives. What we're going to look at now are the official images that were taken of this. Now, this is taken a little bit later, but it's after the fighting has moved on, but it's a perspective shot to show us what the ridge would have looked like from the average British front line. This open bit of ground and then a clear rise and a clear ridge line, which you can see today. In fact, I would always recommend, if you really want to understand the Messines Ridge, come out of Ypres, get to Shrapnel Corner to the south, turn off to the right towards Kemmel and follow that road, and you run parallel at a distance to the ridge, and you get an idea of how long the Messines Ridge is and how prominent it is on that landscape. And we can see that even in this photograph. If I just kind of zoom in on that, we can see it. If you were a British Tommy in a trench some around this tree-lined avenue, and old Jerry's up on the top of the ridge there, he's going to be looking down at you, and anything you do and everything that you do is going to be seen by him. And you can see why they wanted to change that. And the plans for the Battle of Messines that would result in the fighting on the 7th of June 1917 was all part of changing that position, and in fact, as we'll discover, changing that landscape as well. So how do you do it? I mean, this is a rather fanciful illustration of the actual Battle of Messines in June 1917, showing the assaulting infantry going forward and tanks supporting them. I mean, this kind of thing did happen, but the idea of a traditional attack on the ridge, where you just send infantry in, supported perhaps by artillery and by, later on in the war, with the advent of them, with tanks, I think had been proven wouldn't work where the enemy was so dominant, because they commanded the ground, and something needed to be done to neutralize that, to give any attacking force some hope. Because if we go right back to the early British experience in Flanders in December of 1914, the very first British attack of the Great War, it's not really a battle. If you said what was the first British assault of World War One, most people would say Neuve Chapelle in March 1915. But in fact, the two British battalions, part of the 3rd Division, attacked near Whitcharter, Whitesheet, in December 1914. One of them, a Gordon Highlander battalion, that went over the top, and the officers, being a proud Scottish battalion, were carrying their claymores, reputedly waving the claymores above their head as they moved towards the enemy positions. There was almost no bombardment and no support, and that infantry moved in broad daylight out into open ground towards an entrenched enemy, who opened fire and mowed down those men very, very quickly, and that attack faltered quickly as well. And the dead from that assault lay out on the battlefield for a big chunk of the rest of the war. In fact, linking into this battle, their bodies were not recovered until June of 1917, when the Pioneer Battalion of the Ulster Division went out and found the bodies of these Gordon Highlanders and brought them into Irish Farm Cemetery, where a few of them are buried individually, and I think something like 36 in one grave. And they're mentioned in many memoirs as well. Journal of Private Fraser, he looks through a periscope and sees them out in no man's land, and the Burgoyne Diaries is another one where he mentions this. But that was the early attack. And what was realised by the army commander here, who was General Plumer, was that if you just send men up a slope, even with some support, the outcome is probably going to be no different to operations, some of the operations on the Somme and elsewhere, that you had to be slightly more intelligent about this. And being a good army commander, he believed in putting it out there that he accepted ideas from subordinate officers. This was, I think, one of the keys to good command in the First World War, is that you weren't always coming up with these good ideas, but you were open to them from junior officers and staff officers. And by 1917, these kind of men, who are tunnelers of the Royal Engineers, part of a tunnelling company, are very much part of the battlefield landscape. First formed out of ad hoc units at Ypres and in northern France in 1915. They carried out fairly small-scale mining operations at different parts at the front. If you go up to the Bellewaerde Ridge above Hooge, we did that on a podcast meetup in Ypres, you'll find craters from that kind of period. The same on Hill 60 and the Bluff and other areas besides. and the same in other parts of the British sector of the Western Front. And although mines had been used in the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, famously at Hawthorne Ridge, filmed by Geoffrey Malins, and a kind of iconic piece of First World War archive cinema showing the explosion of that mine, the Somme had demonstrated perhaps how not to use mines, because most of those mines had been blown in the first German line position, so in the very front line, where the Germans, as the British discovered and others, they didn't keep the bulk of their men. So in spending all of that time, all of that work like this, in digging under no man's land and laying a charge under the front line, didn't really have the effect that you wanted. And really, you needed to move into the second line where the dugouts were and blow your mine there. So when staff officers came to Plumer with the idea of using tunnelers, not just in penny packets, but in a big mining offensive against the Messines Ridge, where a whole number of these tunnelling companies, British tunnelling companies, Australian and Canadian, the New Zealanders weren't involved because they were further south down at Arras at this time, but those different nationalities working underneath Flanders Fields, bringing them together and digging a whole series of galleries, more than 20 originally, to place mines at key points along the ridge, not under the front line, but go even further underneath that second line. And the idea was that blowing them simultaneously and in large numbers would send this literal shock wave across the ridge, would change the landscape, change the geography of it, and hopefully take out a huge number of the defenders, so that when the infantry went in, supported by artillery, which had been developed at this stage, supported by tanks, it would be a better outcome. And we're not going to go too much into the mines tonight. That's a kind of talk in its own right, but obviously it's one of the big elements of this. Often, I think, discussed at the expense of what happened on the ground, because it's all about mines. Mines were only the first phase of it. But mines resulting in craters like this. This is a post-war photograph of one of the Messines mines, which I'm pretty sure is probably Peckham, given the kind of geography of this, the Peckham crater. Then we can see the kind of explosions that we're talking about here. Massive. I mean, these were anything from 30 odd thousand, multiples of mines of 30 odd thousand, up to 96,000 pounds of aminol explosive, the largest one being at Saint-Eloi in the northern area of the attack. And it certainly, the explosion of those mines did create a unique element, really, to the Battle of Messines, enabling that fighting to go forward. And in kind of in terms of the historical overview of this, so the Battle of Messines, it's a second army sector, 5 armies on the Western Front, of which this is the second army, under the command of General Herbert Plumer, Daddy Plumer. He looks like this cartoon caricature of a First World War general, but in fact, he was one of the best commanders, army commanders on the Western Front. Listened to his men, as we've said, was a master of the Ypres salient, had been there longer than anyone else, knew that ground, and realized by 1917 that as well as putting forward new ideas and putting them into practice, training and preparation was an essential part of an offensive. And for this, models of the battlefield were made behind the lines and every unit was trained on them. So for the first time, ordinary soldiers were told in big numbers, not just specific army corps. The Canadians had done it for Vimy, for example. Some British units had done it in earlier operations as well. But for this battle, everybody was taken to one of these models for a lecture so that you knew what your battalion was doing, your brigade, your division, and what the neighbours around you were doing as well. It sounds obvious, but it was risky because this was a citizen army, 1917, the second year of conscription, many of these men conscripts, and the higher echelons of the army didn't think that those kind of citizen soldiers could be trusted with this information, or that they might not even understand it. But Plumer thought differently. He felt that the more information that you gave to a soldier, the better he would perform on a battlefield. And I think he was proved right. Zero hour was early in the morning, 10 past 3, and that affects what we're about to see in terms of the official record because it's too dark to take photographs and too dark to take film. So, unlike the film of the Hawthorne mine exploding, we have nothing like that for Messines. The weather was good, different to some of the battles that we've previously discussed. Not quite 1st of July 1916 weather, but it was fine, good visibility. There'd been some thunderstorms in the days before the attack, and most of the battle was in pretty good weather. And the front that they attacked along that Messines Ridge was around about 9 miles from Hill 60 in the north down to Plug Street Wood in the south. For our European friends, about 14.5 kilometres. About 100,000 men were ready to go into action at Messines on the 7th of June 1917, and these drawn not just from all over Britain, and there were divisions representing just about every part of Britain in this offensive, but also Australian and New Zealand soldiers as well participating in the assault. The New Zealand division being given the task of attempting to take, which they did, the town, the village of Messines. In fact, it's the smallest town in Belgium. I'm not sure it was given that classification then, but that's what it is today. But the New Zealand division were given that task of capturing Messines itself. And in fact, it was because of the discovery of one of the British mines, it was one of the few parts of the front where a division went into action where there was no mine exploded to assist them in their attack. That mine had been discovered by the Germans in 1916 and flooded, and is still there today underneath the farm as you come out of Messines and head down towards Plugstert. In terms of casualties, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, it's quite difficult often to drill down, even in the official history, precise casualties for a particular day, but the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database is very useful for that. So for the 7th of June 1917, for commemorations in Belgium, they have just over 3,400 dead, which this is a successful battle. Almost all of its objectives are reached and held, but yet there is always this price to pay. I think this is one of the strange things of trench warfare in the Great War. Even when there's success, there's a heavy casualty toll, and it's something I think that more than 100 years later, a lot of people find difficult to understand. But in terms of the total casualties in British and Commonwealth forces, it's around about 17,000 when you take into account wounded and missing. And some units I know that I've researched lost quite a lot of guys where their positions were overrun and men were taken prisoner, particularly around Hollerbeek. But that's kind of a side alley to this. But in terms of the tactics used, we've kind of hinted at that already and discussed a bit of it. I mean, the mine warfare lessons from the Somme were put into play. And for many, many years, you would often read and hear in documentaries that the Messines mines killed 10,000 people, 10,000 Germans in an instant. We now know, I mean, a lot of that comes from the kind of 1960s writing about Alexander Barry's War Underground, for example, that kind of writing, which was written before the availability of war diaries and things like that, and also access to German archives. And I think although 10,000 is probably the casualties that the Germans suffered during that period, it isn't just the dead whose lives were extinguished by the explosion of those mines, but it's certainly a significant number of Germans that were killed in those mine explosions that took out the dugouts and enabled the infantry when they went into action, protected by a creeping barrage, heavy guns saturating the German positions and suppressing them, tanks giving them support, aircraft in the air above. You're beginning to see that development of a true modern battle, something that would take another year or so to finally perfect, but certainly Messines, with the training and preparation and the unique aspect of the mines and the huge amount of artillery employed, I think made it probably the most successful battle fought by the British in Flanders until the very final battles there in 1918. And in terms of the ground, we've got a map showing us the ground south of Ypres. The assault begins alongside the railway line at Hill 60 and extends down across the contours of that Messines Ridge through the village of Saint-Éloi, where the largest mine is blown. 19 of these mines are blown simultaneously, down to around the village of Whitecharter or White Sheet and Messines, right atop the ridge that gives the ridge its name, down to where the ground slopes away in front of the wooded area at Plugstert, at Plug Street, where the Australians attacked. And several of the mines that were planned to be used there were considered of no use to the attack. General Monash, who commanded that attack as a divisional commander, decided not to use them, and they were just simply left until one went off in 1955 in a thunderstorm, and the other two mining positions, are still there. So if you're going to buy yourself a house on the old front line, don't make it there. So in terms of looking at these official photographs, what we've done in previous talks about this, we start with the Imperial War Museum website. I mean, it is a fantastic resource where you can look up all kinds of things. I mean, you know, the minutiae of details on pictures, you can pick that out by putting it into the search engine for this. And in terms of dates, as we've done before, you have to write the date backwards. So 1917, 06, 07 for the 7th of June, 1917. And it gives you the available records and you work your way through them. And, you know, if there's a part of the First World War that you're interested in, then this is a really good way to access those visual records of it, which are, you know, part of one of those many layers of First World War history that we can use to understand the subject. And we always mention a little bit about aerial photography, and actually there's quite a lot of aerial photography for Messines. It seems to have been one of the offensives that was photographed from the air quite a lot. And this is not a particularly good image, but it's an image that shows one of the Kruisstraat craters not far from Witcharter in the kind of central part of the ridge. And it doesn't just show a crater, it shows the markings of some of the tanks that's moved forward with the British to make this attack. And we can see the shell-pocked nature of the ground as well. And I think there are actually, it's not so clear on this one, but on the original, there are tanks marked on there moving forward as well. But aerial imagery, and there's quite a lot of these aerial images that are now on the Western Front Association Trench Mapper site. So when you go onto there and you select an area of the Messines Ridge, let's say, to have a look at, it comes up with the trench maps. They've also geo-referenced the air photos, which then can be overlaid onto it, and that's quite an interesting way of looking at it as well. But air photos are often quite difficult to understand. I just wanted to show one that showed one of the craters. And it always strikes me as odd that they didn't photograph them all. In some respects, I suspect the tunnellers would have liked to have seen an aerial photographic record of it. And maybe with a combination of British and German air photos, because I know that they came over and they photographed some of the craters as well. Maybe there is an air photo of every crater. I'll leave that for someone else to research. But as usual, we're going to focus on our photographers because, you know, these pictures weren't just taken at random. And by this stage of the war, there was a number of official photographers working on the front line. We've mentioned John Warwick Brooke a few times in these recent talks. He took that famous image on the right showing the Cameronians going into a trench raid near Arras, which I use as the kind of main image for the Old Frontline podcast. He was an interesting official photographer. Unlike some of the others, he'd actually seen combat. So he joined as an ordinary soldier in the King Edward's Horse, being awarded the DCM, Distinguished Conduct Medal, for his bravery at Ypres in 1915, and had been wounded, and then became a photographer, and then operated as a photographer for the rest of the war, and took some classic images of the First World War. And he's, out of all of them, I think he's much more like the combat photographers of the Second World War. If I look at a battle like Arnhem and see the men of the Army Film and Photographic Unit, the AFPU, that went into Arnhem, they are much more like John Warwick Brooke in that they're all combat veterans who've been in action before. But that was much more unusual in the Great War, because to have a background in photography normally meant that you came from quite a wealthy or privileged background, because ordinary men and women didn't really have access to cameras in the same way that they would do. I mean, this was a turning point in that, with vest pocket cameras from Kodak and cheap cameras. Again, that's a kind of a subject in its own right. But John Warwick Brooke, really important and perhaps not as well known as he should be, photographer of the First World War. And these are some of his images that he took during that Battle of Messines. Now, because of the darkness, he's not there in the front line as he was, during some of the other battles that he covered. So he goes forward when there's enough light for him to start taking images with his camera. And what he's seeing here is work that is the outcome of success for this battle. So the line has moved forward. Soldiers have gone over the top. They've captured not just the front line, German front line, they've captured often the second line. And certainly by the end of the day, they're beyond the third line trenches. And now you need to connect up the British front line with the old German front lines. You have to dig a trench across no man's land or dig a trench between the first and second German line. You can use the existing German trenches, but they know exactly where they are, so they're going to easily drop artillery on those. So men were brought up to do this. Now, in previous battles of the war, very often the men who were attacking were the ones that were required to do this. But it was again realized by Plumer and his staff that the more burdens you put on a soldier's shoulders, the less he would perform on the battlefield. So in this battle with attacks, they didn't expect one battalion to capture the first, second, and third battalion. One battalion would capture the first, the second battalion would jump through them, leap through them, capture the second objective. The third battalion would leap through those other two and go forward. Meanwhile, the original battalions are always forming a battle reserve for as and when the Germans counterattack. And then when it comes to the kind of donkey work of putting in the infrastructure, now you've captured this position, they've got the backup of Royal Engineers that we see in this photograph and some of the others we're going to see, and also men from the Labour Corps to do this kind of work as well, which is, I think, an important sea change in the way that these kind of units are used on the battlefield. And the engineers are such an important part of the whole history of offensives and trench warfare on the Western Front. So he's taken that shot with them clearly digging a trench, and he's then swung that round. We've got a valley behind us there. I suspect this is quite close to Messines, looking at the geography of it. That could be looking down towards Plugstert Wood in the distance there. We can't see because of the smoke. It's obviously not in direct observation of any German positions that have been captured, because these men have no compunction about standing in broad daylight and doing their work unhindered. I mean, a stray shell or whatever might come over, but they can't be seen by old Jerry, because otherwise I don't think they would be standing there like that. But it gives us a kind of insight into this work. And then he moves on to focus on the medical arrangements. I suspect he got bored taking photographs of people digging trenches, and he moves on to some better subjects. And this is a very nicely composed photograph showing these typical Flanders pollardy trees with a light railway system and a trolley system on it. And this was, again, these are lesser known. They aren't really trains. They are literally trolleys. So it's a flatbed with wheels underneath that operate on a track, a Decauville track, a light railway track, and you can use it to bring up supplies and ammunition. And if you look in the right-hand foreground of this image, you can see some 18-pounder shells that obviously toppled off one of these at some point and rolled over onto the side of the track and are just abandoned there. But in this case, they're being used to move the wounded back. So men have been brought from an aid post on the front line, on the battlefield itself, a regimental aid post, to another collecting point, probably at this stage. This is again a kind of change in the medical arrangements, rather than direct from the aid post to the dressing station. There would be a collecting point somewhere on the battlefield where the Royal Army Medical Corps would go forward, pick up the wounded, and with this kind of infrastructure in place, they can use it to bring back men more quickly, rapidly, to a dressing station to be treated properly. And he took several shots, I think probably of the same trolley, actually, with the same casualties on, moving forward with columns of men going past them. The nearer they get to where the dressing station is, then more men are going past them. And this, I mean, the caption mentions this. It says, "Note a soldier wearing a Yukon pack going up on the left." And you can see that frame with the kind of crisscross, almost like bootlaces on it. In fact, the guy on the right has also got one in his hand. And the Yukon frames were really important bits of kit, because you could strap almost anything to them, and they could be used to carry stuff up to the front line. So you could strap on a big Dixie full of soup or stew onto the back of that, and one guy could carry that up. That could be a section's worth of food, maybe even almost a platoon's worth of food on the back of one man. You could strap on Mills boxes of Mills bombs, grenades, small arms ammunition, Lewis gun drums for the light machine guns, whatever it was. So they were not a new piece of kit, but a piece of kit that was being used much more commonly by this stage of war, to be issued to units that were on carrying parties. It would not often be part of a battalion's equipment. It would be stores in an area, and when they were given a particular task, they would draw on, they would go and get these Yukon packs and use them to carry up the gear. So I mean, it just shows the kind of detail that you can find in these kind of images. And then we get to the dressing station, and looking at this with the sandbag emplacement there, and the fact that they've got guys, it's obviously sunny when he's taking this because they've got them underneath screens protecting them from direct sunlight, and they've used a bit of wobbly tin there on the right for the same purpose. But this is obviously quite some way from where the fighting is, because it's safe to have men lying out like this and treat them like this. And now they're being reassessed, their wounds will be reassessed, someone will come round, see if their wounds need redressing and cleaning, because in the transition from the battlefield to the dressing station, then, who knows what's happened to them. Some men may have been given morphine on the battlefield, and that would be checked on their casualty cards. And then a medical officer will come around and work out what's going to happen to them next. Can they be treated there and sent back? Or do they need further treatment going back towards the casualty clearing station? What are their chances of survival? How are they going to get them back there? And if you look at the medical official history for this, then they were pretty well sorted for the Battle of Messines, with aid posts, collecting posts, dressing stations, and then cab ranks of motorized ambulances taking the guys back to casualty clearing stations behind the lines. And in the Messines sector, they didn't all go to Lissenherk, which is the kind of place that probably most people would think of, where number 3 CCS was located, for example. A big chunk, particularly in the southern area, so from Witcharter down towards Plug Street, so in particular the New Zealanders and the Australians, a lot of their wounded went to Balliol, just across the border in France, where there was a whole host of casualty clearing stations there. And you see that reflected in the men who died of their wounds and the graves in Balliol Communal Cemetery and Extension. And then he went back up the track again to see what was going on back towards the battlefield, and he took some photographs of some pack mules carrying ammunition and supplies up towards the front line, past quite an interesting little communication trench there. I mentioned the journal Private Fraser earlier. Donald Fraser was a Scotsman who served with the Canadians in the Great War. Fantastic memoir, one of my favourites. And that trench is typical of the kind of trenches that he describes in the sector around Kemmel, going up towards Witcharter, when his battalion was there in the quiet period of 1916, before they came down to take part in the Battle of the Somme. And he follows those pack mules up, and this is typical of the kind of battlefield supply. The artillery is being used to such a devastating effect on the battlefield that the ground is smashed up. You can't, perhaps as yet, because the engineers and the Labour Corps have not gone up and built any roads yet, or kind of put any trackways in. So you need to use horses, donkeys, and mules to carry material up to the front line, strapped on the back, and get what is required up there, whether that's ammunition, food, or whatever. And again, this shows the kind of level of preparation for this offensive, which is quite interesting. And then he goes up onto the battlefield itself. The images that we looked at for him for both Arras and the Ancre battles, he really did try and capture some sense of the landscape and the devastation of the landscape. And he's gone up onto the Messines Ridge here, somewhere between Messines and Witcharter, or Oosterverne Wood, that kind of area, and he's photographed what is left of the German trenches. And what we see in this kind of image is the absolute devastation that these trenches have succumbed to in this tremendous bombardment, with this staggering hundreds of thousands of shells dropping onto the German positions. And he's not shy about taking images of the German dead lying amongst them. And it shows, just again, it wasn't just the mines that caused the casualties, it was this devastating bombardment as well. And then he takes this shot, probably going back towards where the sappers were, where he's looking back down the ridge again, back into a little valley there, where the engineers are continuing to dig their communication trench. And although it's dry, don't forget this is the wet Flanders Plain, and we can see those flooded areas just in front of the trench they're digging. And I suspect that trench might have been flooded itself not long afterwards, given the nature of the ground here. And then he's taken another shot, which is not very clear. I think he was having an issue with perhaps either the development of these images or the exposure of these images, because this one isn't particularly clear, but it shows smashed up German positions again. But in the background, there's a column of infantry moving up to continue with the offensive. And going back to the approach to battle at Messines in June 1917, then you've got your leapfrogging battalions in the first stage of the offensive, leapfrogging their way through the objectives, and plenty of reserves close by to go up and ensure that you hold the positions that you've now captured. So in a single day, the British leap from one side of the ridge to the other, and that kind of advance in trench warfare by then was becoming more commonplace. This was unprecedented in certainly in the Ypres salient, but the key was not just the exploitation, the breakthrough in the exploitation. It was holding what you'd taken, and that needed battle reserves. That needed men to come up, and that's what we're seeing here: the movement of fresh troops who have yet not taken part in the first phase of the offensive to come up and hold the ground that the men in the first waves have captured. And that was a really important part, I think, of the success of this battle. So those are the ones that Warwick Brooke took. And then Ernest Brooks, again, somebody we've spoken about, Baby Brooks, as he was known. That's him on the left with his baby face, standing there with Geoffrey Malins, the official cinematographer, on the right. That's taken on the Somme in 1916. Brooks was there on the 1st of July, right alongside Malins, photographing the explosion of the Hawthorne mine and the guys close to the sunken lane. He didn't go into the sunken lane himself, and then he took a staggering amount of images of other aspects of the First World War. And he was then on the 7th of June 1917 detailed to go up and take some photographs, and he took this one in a British position, which must be close to where they made their original jump off. It says men of the 12th Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment in the trenches at Plugsturt Wood. Now, I'm not so sure about that, because 12th East Surreys were up near Saint-Eloi, so I'm not quite sure what they were doing down at Plug Street. I suspect either the unit's wrong or the location's wrong or whatever, but it gives us a bit of an idea into the men. And one thing that you may have caught sight of already in several of the images that we've shown is the number of men wearing shorts. And this is not something that they've kind of done themselves. You know, they've managed to get hold of a pair of shears, and when the sergeant major wasn't looking, they've just chopped off the lower part of their tunic trouser legs to make it a bit more comfortable in the hot weather. These things started to be issued to British soldiers within certain formations. I mean, I'm not sure the Guards division was ever going to be issuing shorts, but certainly certain formations did. And you do see this from kind of 16 into 17, and certainly much more widespread in 1918 as well. And it gives us a nice kind of study of British faces involved in the Battle of Messines in 1917 as well. And then Brooks goes up onto the ridge itself, and he photographs this column again. It's a supply column using the mules going up to the front line, the mules and the horses going up to the front line to deliver whatever is required, and some men actually carrying them as well. If you look, they've got a pole with an ammo crate strung from it, and two men are carrying that forward. I think does it say if it says British munitions carrying party near Plug Street Wood? Well, I actually, when I looked at an original of this in a display some years ago, the insignia on the uniforms looked to me to be New Zealand. So these appear to be New Zealand troops moving up close to Messines itself to exploit the attack on the village and the grounds beyond. And I think one of the officers, there's a little group of officers in the middle there, which includes one of the guys that was accompanying Brooks, but also I think there's a padre there as well. You can just make out an extended dog collar on the original photograph as well. So it's a moment in time. Who knows what kind of conversations were being had there. And then he does go in search of a mine crater. That's something that Warwick Brook didn't do. Which crater this is, I don't know, but he went off to photograph one. He went down into it and he got some guys to stand on the lip of the crater and he took a shot looking up. And it gives us a kind of sense of the enormity of some of these mines. In that sector around Witcharter, which is where he seems to have taken quite a lot of these photographs, the 250th Tunnelling Company, commanded by Major Cropper, was very, very active for this offensive, blowing key mines from Maidlestead Farm to Spanbrook Molan to Peckham to the Cruikshank craters. And I suspect it's one of those in that area there, and giving us again, this kind of insight into just how devastating these mine explosions were. And then he took a few photographs in the Ulster Division sector, which they'd attacked side by side with the 16th Irish Division in the main assault on White Sheet Village, and then moved to the other side of the ridge beyond the position known as Oosterverne Wood, down towards the slopes of the ridge as they moved towards the village of Hollebeek. And then he's found these two officers sitting on a pile of Mills bomb boxes, waiting to move forward. An artillery major and a staff officer, perhaps the staff officer is from the headquarters of the CRA, the Commander Royal Artillery of the Ulster Division, because one of the successes of this battle was the swift movement of artillery. So having captured the first, second, and third German line, having moved from one side of the ridge to the other, you wanted to get guns up there to support that infantry that had captured those objectives, because by this stage of the war, infantry was only as good as the artillery that supported it. And that's what this image is kind of honing in, I think, really in on, is that the importance of having gunner officers there. And we've had Malcolm Vivian's memoirs on the podcast recently talking about the role of forward observation officers, and I suspect that's what that guy is there. And the major's got an MC on his uniform there, so he's seen some gunner action before. And then he's up on the ridge again. I mean, packed columns seems to have been a very common subject matter for these photographs of the Battle of Messines, but this is an interesting one in that it shows one of these columns coming up and they're walking over some assault bridges. Now, by this stage of the war, they were beginning to prefabricate attack bridges, basically assault bridges, for assaults on the German positions. So when you're coming up against some quite extensive German trench lines that are going to need to be crossed, rather than build a bridge from scratch, you actually have pre-made bridges that can be brought up and dropped over those gaps. And that's what we're seeing here. There appears to be, it's not entirely clear on the photograph, but looking at the positions of the men to the left of the track and some to the right, there appears to be some kind of trench line going through there that formed an obstacle to the movement of this traffic. And these assault bridges have been dropped onto it to enable that to go forward. And there were bigger versions of this that could then also be used to bring guns over as well. By the end of the war, they had bridges that were capable of bearing the weight of tanks as well. So again, going back to the role of Royal Engineers, essential to these kind of offensives. The sappers don't really get the kind of plaudits that they deserve for this kind of work, really. And then you always need some captured German kit in one of these photographs, and they've managed to find a field gun somewhere. Probably, if we can inspect it, probably have Bavarian markings on it, because this is all part of a Bavarian Army Corps sector. And they're dragging off this field gun as a war trophy. And quite a lot of equipment was captured in the Battle of Messines. The attack was so quickly moving, it didn't knock the Germans off balance, but the combination of the combination of the explosion of mines, the artillery, and the movement forward of infantry, and the capture of the main lines of German defence meant that a lot of kit was left behind, from machine guns through to artillery pieces, and that all became part of the war trophies. And then on the ridge itself, he goes in search of some German defences and finds some of the kind of typical positions that were up there. Now, today we may well have visited pillboxes on the ridge, and of which there's quite a few, both German from the pre-Battle of Messines period when they were defending the ridge, and then some British ones that were added later on when it was a British position, and the pillboxes were built on the side of the ridge that had originally faced the British lines so that they could be used as signalling posts and headquarters and so on. But most of the German strong points were actually built into existing structures. So they concreted, an existing farmhouse or an existing mill or an existing sugar factory or whatever it was. And this is the kind of typical kind of defense. But they've built it in a way and used prefabricated concrete blocks to expand upon its structure and defenses and create an aperture that a weapon, almost certainly a machine gun, is going to be able to fire out of. It could be that these had also been used as observation posts. And what we're seeing here is something that has been deliberately blasted by artillery. And it's very obvious what it is in this photograph. But I suspect if we saw a German picture of this before the Battle of Messines, it wouldn't have been apparent at all what its use was. But the artillery stripped all that away and destroyed it. And again, Malcolm Vivian, going back to his memoirs, he talks about this bunker busting, and I think we're seeing, a Flanders Messines example of that there rather. So what we've got in this photograph again is another example of one of these quite basic German concrete structures, and you'll see these today on the ridge in Bayernwald. Again, there's one in there which shows these prefabricated concrete blocks kind of put together like Lego and put in place. And there are examples of these blocks used as roadways and drives, front drives all over Flanders. If you go up to Railway Wood, there's a whole load of them there. There's another place on the other side of Stirling Castle. There was a guy in Zillebeek who used to have a load in his garden. I mean, they're all over the place, these things. But it kind of shows how bunker development changed. And what the Germans realized is that if you built rock hard, solid bunkers, and they took a direct hit, the concussion from the direct hit could do a lot of damage to the people inside, if not kill them. And so they found that this kind of structure that would move with the impact of the explosion, if it wasn't destroyed, nevertheless, the people inside wouldn't be as badly injured by the concussion of the blast as it would be if it was a strong, solid concrete box. So that was the kind of difference in the way they began to construct things. And just off to the right, in this image, there's a trench going off, so I suspect it's probably part of a second or third line position, and it's almost certainly a signalling or company headquarters, or even forward battalion headquarters, or an aid post or something, that kind of thing. And then he gets right up onto the crest of the ridge, and I think what we're looking at here is either the second or third German line. This isn't the front line, but this is very typical of. I've got quite a lot of German images of the trenches on the Messines Ridge sector before the battle, and they're quite big trenches, quite wide. They were really, built to last in many respects. And although this has been knocked about by the bombardment, we can see how protection and timber within the trench has been smashed up by artillery fire. Nevertheless, this is clearly still a trench and clearly still usable, and clearly, quite still formidable in many ways, and gives us an idea of the trench lines that were up there on the Messines Ridge. Again, although there's an explosion in the background there, these guys are wandering around in broad daylight on the crest of a ridge. They can't be too worried about wherever old Jerry is, because they can't be in direct observation of him if they're doing that, because I suspect there would be a lot more fire coming down on their position. And one of the things that was found in this area amongst these German positions was this. It says a large church bell found in German support trench near Kemmel. And well, near Kemmel, I would say near White Sheet. In fact, I know for a fact that this was one of the bells from Ypres Church, which the Germans had mounted in their trenches as a gas alarm. Now, that was a really common thing. I mean, I've seen hundreds of pictures of the Germans salvaged these bells from French and Belgian churches and use them as gas alarms. And then this one has been smashed over by the British bombardment. It was lifted out of this and then taken back behind the lines, and I think presented to the King of the Belgians, something along those kind of lines. I've seen another photograph which I couldn't find of that taking place. But where it is today, I don't know. It's the kind of thing you think, did it survive the war? Was it put back somewhere as a trophy? I mean, maybe it's still clapping away in the top of the Witcharter Church spire. Certainly an interesting image. And then he goes behind the lines and he meets up with some of the guys from the Ulster Division who've just come out of the attack, and they've brought back with them some of the souvenirs. These are officers of units in the skins, the Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers, who've come back with Pickelhaubers, the German helmets. I can see Feldmutzers in there, field caps. They've got bayonets, field telephones, rifles. They've got that set of trench periscope binoculars there, um, trench clubs. There's a bloke with a bugle. I mean, there's all kinds of gear. Um, these kind of souvenirs were all part of this uh, of a soldier's life on the battlefields. And I remember interviewing a veteran who had he had a little sandbag attached to his small pack, which he put bits and bobs that he picked up off the battlefield and taken from the bodies of dead German soldiers, badges and iron crosses and belt buckles and all this kind of stuff. And it got full, and they're marching everywhere, and ordinary infantry soldiers can't carry this stuff indefinitely. So he always looked for somewhere where he reckoned he'd be able to work out where it was after the war. And then he dug a little hole and he buried it. And he buried 3 or 4 of these bags with these things in. And then, of course, he never went back. And I said to him, can you not tell me where it is? And he said, oh, after the passage of all this time, I don't remember. So, I've not yet read about someone digging up one of his souvenir bags, but I'm sure perhaps one day one of the archaeologists might find one and think, oh, I wonder how this came to be. And then while he was behind the lines, Baby Brooks went to Loughra Hospice, which had civilians living in it, including these nuns, and he photographed this grave. And it says it's the grave of a it might be the grave of a British soldier. I suspect it probably is, because in the grounds of it, probably just to the left of this photograph, and why they didn't photograph that, I don't know, was this grave, which is the grave of Willie Redmond, who was a nationalist, Irish nationalist MP, who was not a young man, as that wartime sketch of him shows, who'd gone into action at Messines and been mortally wounded and had died in Loughra Hospice, was buried in the grounds of it. His body was then moved to an individual grave after the war near to Loughra Hospice Cemetery, and still is there to this day, one of now only a handful of isolated graves that still exist on the Western Front battlefield. So why they didn't they put that picture up, which is not the same grave, and didn't photograph Willie Redmond's. I mean, maybe that was all part of, unfortunately, the kind of politics of the day. But this was a real kind of turning point, really, and I think that the symbolism of the 16th Irish and the Ulster Division attacking side by side, and the loss of an Irish nationalist MP giving his life for a greater cause, when the whole kind of Irish question before the First World War had been so pertinent, I think is, certainly one of the turning points in the Irish experience in the First World War, and why it is so commemorated in this area today. And then Brooks went up onto the ridge to again photograph his bit of it, to show captured ground, what was left of the German positions. And this is in Oosterverne Wood. There's a whole series of bunkers around Oosterverne Wood today, close to where the British cemetery is located. And some years ago, I went into the woods there, and you can see, I mean, in the Ypres salient, it's not as well defined in the woods with trenches as it is on the Somme or at Arras, but you could see quite clearly the undulations of where trenches had been in that woodland, probably these trenches. So that gives us a bit of an insight into the official record. And I just want to move on for the last stage of this, just to look at something that myself and John Hayes Fisher, I know is here tonight, did more than a dozen years ago now, when we spent quite a few months of our lives at Messines following an archaeological dig that was being led by the gentleman in this image, Simon Verdigam, who many of you know through his work as a battlefield conflict archaeologist. And that led to a 2-part series, World War One Tunnels of Death. And this is one of the transmission cards that we used for that program. But I wanted to share with you some of the photographs of what Simon and his team found, which we filmed and which we spoke about in that documentary. It was truly astonishing to kind of see this, the uncovering of an entire German complex of defences on the Messines Ridge, which had pretty much, survived intact. And the archaeology gave us a lot of new insights. We can see one of the archaeologists geo-referencing some of the positions they'd worked on while John and the team are filming them. And that's Simon sitting, very proudly. I mean, the work he did there was groundbreaking, quite literally. And there he is, kind of looking into some of the positions that they'd found there. But I mean, wasn't just trenches, it wasn't just tunnels. We're going to come on to the tunnels. It was bunkers as well, and this was a large bunker that's very, very close to where the New Zealand Division Memorial is at Messines, just across the road to the left. It was a German bunker built in 1916 with a trench coming into it, and about 300 meters across to the right from this bunker, when we turned up one morning, Simon had found two army boots side by side with the toes skywards, and he said, "What do you reckon?" And I said, "There's a fair chance you've got a body under there." And when we came back, after going to a meeting with someone else, a couple of hours later, he'd found the body of a New Zealand soldier who'd been properly buried, from the Canterbury Regiment. He'd been properly buried, but no identification with him, although he was subsequently reburied as an unknown in Messines Cemetery. And that same bunker, this is a shot taken from within it, looking out straight down the trench. I mean, those are the original wooden steps. It was quite something, kind of to stand in these kind of positions and think this is where German soldiers are going backwards and forwards to the front line, sleeping in here, picking up equipment in here, and these are the very steps that they were walking up and down. I mean, it was just extraordinary. And this particular bunker had this trench coming into it, had these two little alcoves in it, which had flaps over them originally. And when they lifted them up, this is what they found inside, which was a couple of wine bowls and a whole stash of German stick grenades. And we're looking at the bases of them there. The little white things we can see look like pebbles are what you unscrew the base of it and you pull out one of them, which is attached to the detonation cord. And once you tug it, it sets off the friction detonator and the grenade goes off 5.5 seconds later. So these were all live grenades that were stashed in here, ready to be handed out to Deutsche Soldaten, German soldiers, getting ready for the offensive, but never were. And I guess the bombardment and the New Zealanders overran this position before the Germans had a chance to use these grenades. The other thing it kind of gave us an insight into were the trenches themselves. Now, I know we've got trench manuals and drawings and photographs, but I think the ability to literally kind of take these trenches apart and see how they were built really did give fresh insight into how it was done and the type of material. So on the left there, we're looking at duckboarding lifted to show the drainage, quite complex drainage channel underneath. There's a bit of rough timber on the bend there, which was probably part of a barn door or a front door of a building from Messines itself. So they were using just about everything. And then we can see the typical kind of walkway, the duck boards of a trench, which were in perfect condition. And all of this stuff was salvaged and cleaned and preserved and stored, and I think is in some massive archaeological store in Brussels. There was hope that it might be displayed in Messines, but that never happened. And they did find tunnels as well. I mean, we called the program World War One Tunnels of Death, or the network did. And this is when they'd found a tunnel system closer to Messines village behind the German second line. And this was them. They'd pumped out the water. It was full of water. They pumped the water out, and they're now lifting the roof off of it to go inside. And it shows how strong this timber was after nearly a century, because Simon's sitting on top of it while he's doing this. It's strong enough to support his weight. So they lifted it up and then went inside, and this is what they saw. And we can see the marks on the walls where the level of the water had been. We can see an original bench at the bottom of this. I mean, again, this was quite something going in here, because you're literally the first people to see this since 1918, I guess. I mean, there wasn't iron crosses and pickle albers hanging on every peg in there, but it was, just left as it was at the end of the war. And it gave us this really interesting insight. And what the Germans seem to have done at Messines is built this network of very shallow tunnels that enabled their machine gun teams to move around, because at junctions of them, Simon found ammunition stashes and then what were obvious pop-up points where teams of machine guns could go through these tunnels, get what ammunition they needed, get to one of the pop-up points, pop up, fire their weapon in directly, and then if the British realised that machine gun fire was coming down on their position, the Germans would pop back down into the tunnel system again and move the gun to a different position. So it was quite complex. And again, this kind of gave us new insights into it. But one of the other things that we saw watching them do this work over many months was how the weather changed it, and how the weather then replicated the conditions that the men who were there in the Great War lived in. And this is a group of young archaeologists trying to dig out a position that's full of glutinous Belgian Flanders mud, and they're facing exactly the same kind of privations and problems and awfulness that soldiers had to do that under fire during the Great War. And this mud, I can assure you, because we got covered in it too, it just went everywhere. It got under your fingernails and in your ears and, everywhere, basically. And you were still smelling that blue clay mud wherever you went. It was, again, I use that word a lot, extraordinary. It was extraordinary. And the mud was a great preserver because of the blue clay in it. And this is a clip of British 303 ammunition, which was pulled out of mud like that. And all they did was wash it in a bucket and it came up, almost new like this. It didn't need a lot of cleaning. So it was amazing how well the ground had preserved some of the material there. And this was typical of what they found: small arms ammunition, and also machine gun ammunition. This is a whole belt of 303 in an ammunition box that was pulled out of one of the shell holes they found, which I think was the remains of an Australian machine gun position, and they found the ammo to go with it. I think when they analysed the rounds, they were made in Australia. I think that's what connected them eventually to the AIF, to Monash's 3rd Australian Division in that sector. But it was an amazing time. I think we spent nearly 9 months going backwards and forwards and filming there. That series is available on Amazon Prime, and I think Apple TV as well. So it's out there to watch. And I think for me, I was looking through the photographs of the hundreds and hundreds that I took during our time there. And I think for me, this kind of rounds it off really, and goes to the heart of what we do on the podcast, because this is where the old world meets the new, the earth, the turning of the sod, uncovering the past through the archaeology of the Great War, and in the background, the modern world ticks along and carries on just as it should. And I think that's the eternal nature, really, of the old front line.